Tommy Oliver, you directed the documentary 40 Years a Prisoner about the conflict between Philadelphia and the revolutionary group MOVE, and specifically Mike Africa Jr.'s efforts to get his parents out of prison. They were imprisoned as a result of the raid of MOVE. So being from Philadelphia yourself, was this a story you were acquainted with before you decided to make the film, or was this something you were learning about through this process?
I really wasn't. So growing up in Philly, you sort of hear about Move. They're sort of this omnipresent idea, but I'd never really heard about them with much clarity. It was always there was some group and there was some bombing and there was something, but I never really understood what happened. And so at some point, I just started to do my own research and I went down the rabbit hole, reading book after book, watching everything that I could, reading every single article that I could. There's a Urban Archive at Temple, and they've got a ton of stuff. I went through most of that. And after that, I realized there was still something missing. And so I had a buddy make an intro to Move and made an intro to Ramona Africa. And she brought along Mike Africa Jr. with her. And he and I, it changed everything when we met, because despite all of what this guy had gone through, and he was born in prison, he had literally never seen his parents outside of prison. And for me, also understanding that 7 of the 9 people who were convicted were still in prison. 2 of them had died. And that this guy who, despite everything, didn't have a shred of bitterness about him. To me, there was just something incredibly beautiful about him and his journey to get his parents home. And so that sort of set me on the dual path of chronicling his story to get his parents home, and then trying to really understand what happened in 78 that put them there in the first place. On top of that, the realization that the things MOVE fought against some 40 years ago, police brutality, wrongful incarceration, systemic racism, were the same things we were fighting against when I started, and sadly, are the same things we're fighting against today.
And what is interesting about telling this story is the film is dealing with a lot of how, piecing together a narrative of events when you have maybe unreliable police sources who have their own agenda, media sources that have their own biases. What was it like trying to piece this story together for the film in a way that was truthful when there's so much conflicting agendas and sort of the way history is told?
That was my whole thing. There was no definitive account of what happened in 78. And so I and my team, we went through a ton of stuff, because for me, we had to tell an accurate story. We had to figure out what happened. And that meant going through every single piece of archival that we could find. That meant going through, I think we digitized 10,000 plus pages of court transcripts. We talked to everybody that we could, but it really came down to wanting to tell a balanced, accurate, honest account of what went down. And it wasn't easy, because many of the people who were around then aren't around, and a lot of stuff had been lost. And so it took a whole lot, but if we couldn't corroborate something, it wasn't going in.
And what was like, because you interview with a lot of people who were there at the time, people from MOVE and people in law enforcement and reporters. What was it like reaching out to people, asking them to sort of to tell this story and getting these different points of view?
It was a combination of things. And part of it was, at the time, MOVE was demonized, and they were treated as sort of subhuman by the media. And when you do that, it becomes really easy to justify anything that happens to a people, because it's no longer people, it's them. And once it's them, it doesn't really matter. And so whether it's out of sight, out of mind, or these people are being slaughtered, but whatever, they deserved it. And so there were people who didn't quite understand. And there were people who thought that things should have been left alone. But for us, it was about finding people who had firsthand knowledge and who were willing to talk. And so we went through a lot of people, and we went through a lot to just figure out how to tell a complete story, because the wounds and the scar tissue that come from something like this, especially in a place like Philly, it doesn't go away overnight. And it's something that we had to sort of work our way through.
and you know, you follow a lot of the film, Mike Africa Jr.'s efforts to get his parents released. Like how long was that process from the point that you started shooting with him, and it's sort of uncertain how that process will end. So like how emotionally invested did you find yourself getting into the outcome that we finally get in the film?
So the whole process took maybe 3.5 years or so, and I got to know Mike very well during that time, and he actually became a really good friend because for me, and I don't think I quite realized this until somewhat recently, that one of the reasons I think I sort of fell in love with this story was, again, he was just a kid who wanted his parents home, and me thinking back to what I wanted as a kid, all I wanted was my parents. My dad, I never met my dad, and so he wasn't around. My mom wasn't around for different reasons, and so there was something very human about that, and it's hard to not root for somebody like Mike who's willing to do whatever it takes to get his family. And so I got to know him pretty well. I also got to know his parents pretty well because we went to go visit them. And his mom was in Cambridge Springs, which is 7 hours away from Philly. And so we drove back and forth to see her a number of times. We drove back and forth to see his dad. And so it was something that for me is like there was no way to not be emotional about it, especially given how they were just really good people. And so that said, I had no idea how this thing was going to end at all. And to get this sort of fairy tale ending, which isn't likely or common, was just incredible for them.
And what was it like getting to shoot those scenes of you know Mike being sort of reunited with his mother first, and then his father, sort of like, I mean, they've seen each other, but for the first time outside of prison. Like, what was it like to be able to be there for that?
It was equal parts beautiful and scary. Beautiful for the reasons that you could imagine, seeing them together and the joy in their eyes, and it's something that he had been fighting for so long, and scary because I very nearly got arrested a number of times because Pennsylvania does not like nor allow cameras of any sorts on prison and on prison grounds, and so recording those even for a second was a really dangerous thing. And there were times where I was surrounded by, I don't know, 4 cop cars, 7 cops. Like, it's just all sorts of craziness. But there was no way that I couldn't get those moments because you don't get those things again. And they were 40 years in the making. And not even for the sake of this project, but just for them. And so it was something that was just absolutely beautiful. And if you think about the end of the film, when Mike Sr. is sitting down, he talks about how them coming home freed Mike. And that's so much of what it's about, because 40 years a prisoner actually refers to Mike Jr., not Mike Sr. or Debbie. It's the idea of them being home removed the weight, the burden of his every waking moment going to trying to free his parents. And so to answer your question, it was absolutely beautiful and emotional and a little bit scary.
And you know, the film deals so much with these conflicting narratives, and as you say, it's still relevant to what we're experiencing today. But in a sense, in a way, the film sort of gives you sort of the ability, or it compels you to look at like local news and all these, you know, police narratives, and look at them more critically. When we had previously sort of, you know, many people might have accepted them on face value. What do you hope people sort of take away from seeing this story and sort of relating it to what we're seeing today in terms of how we're getting the information we're getting, and maybe it's not all exactly what it's cracked up to be?
So police brutality isn't getting worse, it's getting recorded. And so much of what you saw in the film was the difference between what was portrayed versus what actually happened, and the chasm in between. And back then, there was no way to corroborate things, and we are inclined to believe our elected officials, to believe cops, to believe the commissioner, the police commissioner, where if he says something is a certain way, particularly if he's up there flanked by the mayor and the DA, that he's speaking truthfully, but he wasn't. And so when that's where we're getting our information, but it's a flat out lie or misrepresentation, it's a scary thing. And the sad and terrifying thing is that so much of what happened in that film, in my film, it was 40 years ago, but it could have been 20 years ago. It could have been 10 years ago. It could have been 4 years ago. It could have been 40 minutes ago. And nobody would bat an eye. And that is a terrifying prospect because we have so much work to do. And I think that we are trending in the right way. And I think people have woken up a little bit. But if all we're doing are the things that sort of make us feel good, the surface level stuff is not going to change. There's so many systemic issues. People look at the idea of, 9 people were convicted for the murder of 1 cop. That's crazy. How could that happen? That just sounds insane. That is an instance of the legal system operating exactly and specifically as it was designed. They didn't do anything extra legal. They didn't break any laws in order to do that. And so there are many things that we need to do. And so to your earlier point, we need to pay attention to local politics, to local government, to all of those things, to who our elected officials are, to changing legislation, and not just the sizzle of sort of making yourself feel good.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the film, and thank you so much for talking with me about it. We're going to bring you back later on for our group discussion.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Daniel.